Let me introduce to you our speaker, Melvina Ford. Ms. Ford became the Executive Director of the Equal Rights Center in 2014. And as the Executive Director, she leads all operations of the organization, including strategic and financial planning, development and communications, human resources, and mission-driven programming. I love that word because I think we do that as well. Social justice is quite a mission of this university, and this falls into that category. She previously was a presidential appointee in the U.S. Department of Labor, serving as the Senior Policy Advisor to the Administrator of Wage and Hour Division. There she provided policy counsel to the Acting Deputy Director on Enforcement and regulatory issues related to a wide variety of federal labor laws. And she directed the development and implementation of key policy changes throughout the division's field enforcement operation. During her tenure, she also got to act temporarily for the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office Policy, where she managed the department's regulatory agenda, advised the Acting Secretary on policy issues, and coordinated with the Executive Office of the President and other federal agencies. Prior to her appointment, she was the Executive Director of the Employment Justice Center, a DC-based nonprofit dedicated to securing, protecting, and promoting workplace justice in the DC metropolitan area. She's also been a litigator with an emphasis on labor and employment law as an associate of the law firm of Tidings and Rosenberg. Ms. Ford graduated from Georgetown University Law Center, and she's a member of the bar in Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. Welcome to American University.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I feel like there's a real synergy between all of the sponsors of this program and the Equal Rights Center. So, you know, there's a nod to the library, and for me, you'll hear me talk about civil rights testing, and it's really, that for me is about data and research, right? And then, of course, you have your Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and that is the ultimate goal of the anti-discrimination work that we do with the Equal Rights Center. And finally, it looks like this is also co-sponsored by, the K Spiritual Life Center, which has a unique synergy with the ERC because the ERC was started over 30 years ago by a group of clergy, believe it or not. There was a rabbi, a priest, and a pastor, and no, that is not the beginning of a corny joke. They really did start the organization more than 30 years ago, and so it has as its roots really a place in spirituality and understanding the role that spirituality plays in the social justice movement. So I applaud you and feel like we are kindred spirits in this work. So I want to tell you a little bit about what brought me to the Equal Rights Center, which was a long time ago. I grew up in a house with Black Republicans, and so my rebellion as a teenager was to become as liberal as humanly possible. So when I went to college and I had an interest in kind of labor and workplace issues because we had some folks in our family that did union work, and I started to hear about these cases, these Supreme Court cases that were basically rolling back a lot of the employment discrimination protections that had been passed, the oldest being the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so I got the bright idea that I was going to come to DC the summer after my junior year of college to intern at the NAACP field office. And I took out a loan so that I could pay my expenses for the summer, and I spent the summer basically being their receptionist. 80% of my time I was answering phones, and that's literally what I did. But for 20% of the time, the lawyers from the Legal Defense Fund had come down to DC, and they were lobbying for passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1991. And that's the civil rights law that was designed to roll back all of those problematic Supreme Court decisions. So like, for example, there was a case called Patterson versus McLean where the Supreme Court in its infinite wisdom had decided that you couldn't use Section 1981 to file against racial harassment on in the workplace. So I literally carried the bags of these, what I consider to be civil rights and human rights giants on the Hill. And they let me come to their meetings, and I didn't say anything, but I remember being outside of the chamber at one point when Senator Kennedy came out to talk to one of the lawyers, and they were strategizing about, well, what should I say next about this issue? Someone brought up this point. And I just remember sitting there in awe and thinking, when I grow up, I just want to be one of these people. So 25 years later, my dream came true, and I got the chance to come work at the Equal Rights Center. So a little bit about the Equal Rights Center. We're a national nonprofit that fights discrimination. We use a very special tool to identify discrimination called civil rights testing. Now, you might ask, why does this require a very special tool? So discrimination has changed, right? Back in the day, probably long before most of the people in this room remember, frankly, long before really I remember, discrimination came usually with some name calling. Maybe there'd be a noose. Maybe there'd be something burning on your front yard. You really didn't have to guess whether or not you were being discriminated against and whether or not people didn't like you, right? It came with warning labels. Now it doesn't really come with warning labels. Oftentimes it comes with a handshake and a smile. And sometimes the person who has the smile and the person they're shaking hands with have no idea that it's actually occurring. Because sometimes it's not even conscious among the people in the transaction, right? So that's why we use civil rights testing. That gives us a way to identify and find racism and discrimination in places where you might not see it. So I think about it as a former litigator in the labor and employment space in terms of applying for a job. And this was actually my first introduction to the concept of testing was in the litigation space. When you are applying for a job, oftentimes you have no idea who got the job, right? If it's a small place, you might be able to figure out who got it via Google, yay. But oftentimes, you don't know. Most people applying for jobs have no idea who got the job. They don't know anything about that person's background. So they have no basis upon which to try and assert that they were more qualified than the person who actually got the job, right? So this is where civil rights testing comes in, because we can literally craft a project that allows us to test whether or not the people who are getting callbacks for jobs are actually more qualified than the people who are not getting called back for jobs. So why do we do testing? We test to educate the public about what's actually happening in discrimination in a variety of forms. We test to encourage businesses to actually reform their practices to make their businesses more inclusive. And we test sometimes for enforcement purposes. When we can't get people to come along with a carrot, every once in a while you have to use a stick. And the ERC is in a very special place in that it can be an organizational plaintiff in litigation. So in situations where you have, from my background, low-wage workers who oftentimes can't even get in the door to see a lawyer, they just don't have access to those kinds of resources, or you have, this is one of my favorite new ones, the proliferation of arbitration clauses that people unwittingly sign off on all the time that almost waive their rights to get into court. Well, oftentimes the ERC as an organizational plaintiff can get over those sorts of things, which makes it a very powerful organization and civil rights testing a very powerful tool. So what is testing exactly? Who in here knows what civil rights testing is? So a couple of people. Okay, so the way I like to think about civil rights testing is it's similar to secret shopping. So you've all heard of people who maybe get paid to go into a restaurant, order some food, assess the quality of the food and the service, and then report back out on what their experience was like, right? Of course, that happens now via Yelp for free mostly, but there used to be people who did that. So testing is kind of like that. We have paid testers that are going into particular situations and assessing kind of what the transaction is like. I like to think of it as kind of secret agents for justice, which is why I thought this was really cute, this picture. Sometimes I like hear the Mission Impossible music like playing in the back of my head. It seems very appropriate. But there is an actual definition that is not as fun. So I'll just read it to you because. So testing is a controlled process designed to identify differences in treatment accorded to individuals who are similar in every significant respect, except the variable being tested, be it race, national origin, disability, gender, all of those particular issues. So it's really a lot more like science, right? You have a control, it's a controlled environment. We really are testing to identify particular data and particular research. So we are a civil rights organization. So we are testing under what are a panoply of civil rights laws. So these are just a sampling of some of the main civil rights laws that we are testing under, and these are the federal laws. So Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is where you get Title VII in the employment discrimination cases. My personal favorite, 1991, which actually passed the summer after I interned from the NAACP. I'm going to take just a little bit of credit for that. I held a lot of bags. The Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, so a long list of federal statutes that we're able to test under. And those statutes generally have a list of what we call federally protected classes, and these are the basic ones. So everyone knows of race, color, religion, national origin, disability, sex, familial status, in some instances age. And so when you'll hear me talk about protected testers and control testers, so protected testers are the ones that line up with these federally protected classes. In addition to the federal statutes, there are also state statutes and localities that have their own statutes. DC, for example, has 19 different protected classes. I think it is the jurisdiction with the most protected classes in the country. Maybe close in line is San Francisco. I think they're neck and neck in some sort of race, which is good. You know, if we can foster some sort of competition.
Talk for a minute about familial status. Does that mean pregnant women?
So pregnant women actually comes in under the gender space, but in DC there is a familial status protected class. It's also recognized really under the federal statutes as well. It usually comes in the gender space. So we do some testing in familial status under the Fair Housing Act. So like for example, maybe if you are a single mother with a child and you have a young child, I have a 5-year-old. He's fun, he's very loud. But you're not as a landlord entitled to assume that every single mother with a child is not allowed, they can only live on the basement floor of your building, for example, because you're assuming that every 5-year-old child is going to be loud. I can tell you there are very few 5-year-old children that are as loud as my child. So you're not allowed under the law to make that assumption, because that assumption is discriminatory under the Fair Housing Act, for example. Mm-hmm. All right, so testing is actually not new. It's actually been around for a long time. So the very first instance of testing being recognized by the Supreme Court was actually back in 1958. So it was around the same time as the Montgomery boycotts with Rosa Parks. And there they had a black tester in Tennessee that was riding the Tennessee bus system who got removed from the whites only section. His case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held that he had standing as a tester to sue the state of Tennessee because he was removed from that bus. It took a mere 24 years later for the Supreme Court to decide that there was standing for testing outside of that context, and they actually found that under the Fair Housing Act, individual testers and also organizations like the ERC could sue under the Fair Housing Act and would have standing to do that. A year after that Supreme Court decision was released, the Equal Rights Center was actually formed as the Fair Housing Council of Greater Washington, and it was formed specifically to be able to do testing under the Fair Housing Act. And then the federal government started to get involved in the game. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development has been funding testing since 1987. They are funding it through various organizations like the ERC and the Ground all over the country. They also initiated a nationwide discrimination in housing testing project that studies discrimination all around the country, and it's replicated every 10 years. So they did the first one in 1989, they did another one in 2000, they did another one in 2011, and it's an opportunity to be able to see from decade to decade what is actually happening in housing discrimination. The U.S. Department of Justice established its own testing program, mainly in the housing space, but also in the accessibility for individuals with disabilities space in 1989. Or 1992. And then in 1994, a really critical case for the ERC, the Fair Employment Council of Greater Washington sued to have their organization recognized to be able to bring suits based on testing research in the employment space. And shortly after that, that organization merged with the housing group, and we got the baby, the ERC. The Equal Opportunity Commission, which is the government agency that oversees discrimination complaints, both individually and systemically, has tried over the years to do some testing in the employment context, but it has not been well received by Congress. And every time they've tried to do it, they've been blocked in terms of funding. Initially in the Gingrich era, I know people remember that, the contract with America, where they basically told them they could not use any funding to do testing in the employment context, which is probably why you see a lot less testing in that space than what you see in the housing space, because HUD is actually funding that work. Oh,
Yeah.
there we go. Okay. They're getting ahead of me. They want me to be faster. Am I talking too fast? Okay. So what can be tested? Basically, we can mirror almost any kind of transaction in the testing space. So it could be something on the internet. Right now we're experimenting with posting resumes for those online job search websites where people can actually contact you if your resume is posted. So we're doing some experimenting there. Obviously, in-person transactions can be tested, telephone testing. We do a lot of resume testing in the employment space. So basically, we can mirror almost any kind of transaction. The only space where we have been really limited in our ability to kind of get in and mirror that mirror transactions in the criminal justice space, and that's only because we don't want our testers to be harmed, and we don't want to put them in a space where they could potentially be harmed. And obviously also dealing with children, because clearly we're not going to try and have children, well, good luck trying to get my child to come in and actually remember a script. But so there are some limited circumstances in which we aren't able to test, but we can mirror pretty much any transaction. So reasons to test. This is really kind of like how we get started on a particular testing investigation. Sometimes they come to us as complaints. So another organization may come across a situation where they have a particular builder or a particular employer that they believe is discriminating against a particular person. And the great thing about complaint-based testing is you can essentially take the situation where people think they're seeing the discrimination but they're not sure, and you try to recreate it. And this provides the sort of corroborative evidence that you might have in a complaint situation where one individual either can't determine that discrimination is actually happening, but they have a sneaking suspicion, but it's not going to be enough for them to be able to substantiate their situation in court, for example. The other way in which we get into testing is more a systemic-based investigation, and I'll talk you through what some of our investigations have looked like over the last couple of years. Those are really designed to open up entire areas for groups of people. So for example, we've been doing a lot in the LGBT space for the last couple of years, in line with what you're seeing in terms of the movement of making sure that we have a more inclusive environment in that space. And then lastly, a place where we do testing is what I call compliance testing. This is where you have corporations who actually want to engage someone to make sure that their interactions with the public are not discriminatory. And we have a number of contracts with corporations. So for example, CVS, where a number of their locations around the country, we've looked at them to make sure that they're accessible for people who have mobility impairments. And we're doing a lot more in kind of the retail space right now. So there are three basic kinds of tests. There are also lots of iterations of these and also some other nuanced ways to do it, but these are really the three basic kinds of tests that we do. So the first is called match pair testing. It's the most common type of testing that you're going to come across in this space. Okay. So match pair testing, there's two people in a match pair test, right? So the first one, I want to do this the other way. I forgot, they come up in some weird sequence. Okay, so we have two people who are similarly matched in almost every respect, right? We send them out to, let's say, an apartment complex, and they're both trained to ask for one-bedroom apartments. They both have an income of $50,000 a year. They're both male. One is African American and one is white. So we want to know what happens when you send these two people to the same place to inquire about this one-bedroom apartment. So for the African American tester, he's told that there's no apartments available. The white tester is told that there are 3 apartments available. The African American tester is told that there's a $100 application fee. The white tester is told there's a $25 application fee. This still happens. This is precisely the kind of housing testing that we're doing right now, where we are seeing this kind of disparate treatment when we send people out to a particular location. Sometimes what we will also do is to sweeten the pot a little bit about why, and we'll make the protected tester, so in this case, because we'd be testing for race, a bit more qualified than the control tester. So for example, we might give the protected tester a slightly higher income. So maybe their income is $55,000 instead of $50,000. And what we're really trying to get at is we're trying to control for, is it really race that's prompting this decision? Particularly then when we think that when someone's applying for an apartment, it's really supposed to be their income, maybe their credit. Those are the sorts of things that we would think traditionally someone renting an apartment would care about, right? We also are concerned that discrimination occurs in a myriad of ways. Sometimes it's not that straightforward. Oftentimes we train our testers to record the kinds of things they're being told by agents or whoever it is they're talking to in that transaction. And sometimes what we'll hear is that the white tester is told about how the schools are really great. They're told about how safe the neighborhood is. And then the black tester, they're told the same rental price, they're told the right applications amounts, but they're told things that are not necessarily encouraging to them for moving into that particular neighborhood. Sometimes they're even told about other buildings that are located in places that are more urban, right? So it's not as straightforward as the amounts are different. We can tell by the statements that are being made that one applicant is being encouraged while one is being discouraged. So I want to talk you through some of the more systemic investigations that we've done in the last couple of years. We worked with an organization called SAGE, so Services and Advocacy for Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Elders. And we did a testing investigation across 10 states. We did 200 tests, and the tests were designed to measure the extent of adverse and differential treatment. And we used matched pair telephone testing, where we had someone who was a member of an LGBT couple calling to see if there was senior housing available, and then someone who was non-LGBT calling to the same facility to see if housing was available. This is important because everyone knows that we have an aging population. I mean, right now we have over 44 million folks who are over the age of 65. By the year 2060, when I will be firmly in that group, that number will double to about 98 million. They're expecting to see the same trend with respect to our LGBT population. Right now we have a little less than 2 million that they can identify that's in that population of over the age of 65. They're expecting that to double by 2030. So obviously people are going to need a place to live. And when you marry that with the Supreme Court just deciding in June of this past year that states cannot prevent LGBT couples from marrying, you recognize that there's going to be a need for senior housing for married couples that are within the LGBT community. So this was the first of its kind testing in this space to get a sense of what sort of housing is out there for this community and whether or not they're being discriminated against in this space. So the results of that testing. So out of 200 tests, 48% showed some level of negative disparate treatment. So what do we mean by negative disparate treatment? The LGBT tester was given fewer rental options, they were quoted higher fees or a higher rental price, or there were more onerous application requirements quoted, or they were not told about financial incentives. You know, oftentimes you'll apply for rent and they'll have a reduced security deposit or 1 month free. They weren't told about any of those sorts of incentives. So we had some states that did better than others. Our friends who need to do a lot of work apparently are in Arizona and Georgia. Arizona had an 80% disparate treatment rate. Georgia had a 70% disparate treatment rate. Following along that was surprising. Colorado had a 50% disparate treatment rate and Florida had 45%. The other states seemed to hover somewhere between 40 and 45%. The least amount being found in Washington state, which had a panoply of laws, believe it or not, that were designed to protect LGBT folks in the housing space. And so we think that that played some role in the lower level of disparate treatment for those folks.
Was there any distinction on gender? That is to say, two men in a relationship, two women?
I believe they did women. And part of the issue, and we always go back and forth with this, is the pool has to be so much bigger because in order to do both, so usually we'll make a decision that we're going to do gay male couples or gay women couples and stick with that, unless we have the opportunity, someone comes along and says, we're going to give you an infinite amount of money and you can make the pool as big as you want. And as the pool gets bigger, then we have the ability to actually slice and dice a lot more.
For that research study and for more broadly your studies, how do you guys choose your research sites within the states?
So it depends. It depends, and sometimes it depends on the particular aim of the study. So if we're trying to look at a more urban area, for example, then we might go there. Sometimes we're looking at the particular player in the market. So if it's like a particular builder or developer or management company or retail space, but they have a lot of penetration in the market, we might decide to focus on locations that deal with that particular player. So it really depends on kind of what the end game of the research project is, but there is a lot of work that goes into figuring that out as a part of the plan. So one of the other systemic projects that we did, also in the LGBT space, but in the employment space, was a project with an organization called Freedom to Work, which does work trying to expand employment law protections for LGBT persons. And we looked at federal contractors and their anti-LGBT hiring bias. We selected 8, 7 of whom did not have policies that prohibited employment discrimination against LGBT applicants. This project was actually done because at the time there was a push being made for an executive order out of the White House to ban discrimination against LGBT applicants in employment by federal government contractors. And so this was done in line with that executive order kind of sitting there. When we did this work, it was a match pair resume testing investigation. We found that there was a 23% less likely chance for an LGBT applicant to receive a callback when their resume was sent over. One of the people we actually tested was ExxonMobil, which obviously has very large federal contracts. And this is, we call the tale of 2 ExxonMobil applicants, to give you a sense of kind of what the testing project actually looked like. So we sent 2 resumes. This is example 1 for Jennifer, 1 for Michelle. We actually made the LGBT resume slightly more qualified than the non-LGBT resumes. So in this instance, the LGBT applicant had superior grades. They had more relevant experience. So if it was in front of the same person, which is not something we can always control, logic would tell you that the LGBT applicant should get a callback before the non-LGBT applicant. Well, so here's what happened. The non-LGBT applicant got a callback for the interview. The LGBT applicant did not. When the non-LGBT applicant did not respond to the callback for the interview, Exxon called again. And when that person didn't respond again, they called to let them know the position was still open in case they were interested. So what happens with this kind of testing research? Well, 1, there's some active litigation actually going on in Illinois right now against ExxonMobil related to their treatment of LGBT applicants. 2, Exxon has now decided that it would be a good idea to have a policy against discrimination for LGBT employees. And 3, shortly after we finished this research project, the president issued his executive order banning discrimination against these applicants by federal contractors. So single part test is another kind of general test that we do a lot. This is where you have one tester that's generally going in to get information about a specific policy or practice of a business or of a person. So an example of that is what I would call our source of income testing. So how many people know what the Housing Choice Voucher program is? Same people who know about testing. So how many people have heard of Section 8? So I don't. Do you remember the recent news story? I think it was this. Was it this summer? It was this summer. So in McKinney, Texas, with the young lady who was at the pool and tennis club, and how that whole brouhaha got started was somebody made a comment about black people being in the neighborhood and they must be here on Section 8. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program is what used to be Section 8. And it assists almost 2 million people who are low income in the U.S. right now to find quality housing. Now, obviously, one goal is to make sure that people have housing, but the other main stated goal of that program is to allow people to move into better neighborhoods. Better neighborhoods have better schools. They're safer. They have better grocery stores. You can get to a Whole Foods or a Wegmans or a Trader Joe's in a nicer neighborhood. You just have access to a lot more things in those nicer neighborhoods. So part of that program is designed to allow families to move into those neighborhoods so they can have access to those sorts of things in the community. In DC, there are about 10,000 people who are currently receiving housing choice vouchers. Many more thousands are actually on a waiting list to be in that program. And so the Housing Choice Voucher Program is a significant source of income for these folks to be able to live in nice neighborhoods or live at all in any neighborhood. So DC is special in that it has a law that prohibits discrimination against source of income. And so the Housing Choice Voucher Program is a source of income. This is a slide with a lot of text, but basically what this slide says is when you are in a jurisdiction that has a source of income anti-discrimination law, the people who are utilizing those housing choice vouchers, not only are they able to utilize them more, but they are utilizing them in better neighborhoods. They're utilizing them in neighborhoods that are more diverse and that have access to more services. So the impact of those two programs working together really has an impact on the reduction of racial segregation and discrimination in housing. And there are not a lot of states and jurisdictions that have passed anti-discrimination laws in the source of income space. So outside of DC and also Montgomery County, Maryland, which is a local jurisdiction, we really have California, Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, Utah, Vermont, and Wisconsin. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of other jurisdictions who have source of income laws. So the ERC did a single part testing project in the source of income space back in the early 2000s. And I know you're like, why are we talking about things that are in the early 2000s? Well, because we do follow-up testing so we can get a sense of how things have changed over time. In the early 2000s, when the source of income discrimination law was still relatively new, the documented rate of discrimination against folks using housing choice vouchers in DC was 61%, which is very high. So obviously there was an education gap between the people who were renting places to live and their knowledge about the source of income law. We did 75 tests to establish that 61% discrimination rate, and that involved 13 different management companies. As a result of that testing, the ERC did a lot of education and also enforcement, litigation, to make sure that people came in line and complied with the new source of income anti-discrimination law. And as a result of that work, there were 15,000 units that were opened up in DC to low-income residents using housing choice vouchers. So we did follow-up testing in 2013, so almost 10 years later. And in that testing, the rate of denial went down to 36%. So obviously not a panacea. We still have a lot of people out there that are violating the law, but there's a big difference between over 60% and 36%. So we've seen a significant drop. In that case, we did 100 tests, and there were only 24 folks who refused to rent to someone because they had a voucher. There were another 9 who claimed to not know what they were doing. So we engaged in some education with them. So the last type of test that I want to talk about is site survey tests. So site surveying tests, it's a very specific kind of testing that's designed to assess whether or not a particular building or structure is accessible for people with disabilities. And it typically involves taking measurements or photos, but it can also be other things as well. So like for now, we're seeing a lot more requests and a lot more work in the website accessibility area, which obviously is very different from taking measurements and taking photos. So there are more than 57 million people in the United States that live with a disability, including 23 million that have mobility impairments, so they use a wheelchair, for example. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is the law that was designed to ensure that all people with disabilities are able to fully participate and do all of the things that all of us do every day, you know, being able to go to a restaurant or go to a movie theater or get into a cab or use Uber. I mean, whatever it is we all do every day, the ADA is designed to ensure that people with disabilities are able to engage in those same activities. Protected class, individuals with disability, they're a rather unique protected class because they're the only protected class where the design of a building can actually be discrimination. And so when we talk about accessibility testing, we're really talking about the ability to access structures in buildings. So like this room, for example. And where the ERC is particularly focused right now are on places of public accommodation, so restaurants, retail stores. But all of the things that you think about in your daily life are places of public accommodation. When you go to Giant or Safeway or Wegmans or Whole Foods, grocery stores, any of department stores, Macy's, Nordstrom's, all of those places are places of public accommodation. Professional offices, even hospitals, doctors' offices are all places of public accommodation. I find that there's a lot of issues in healthcare facilities and doctors' offices, which I find amazing in that space because you would think that they would be the first people to know that they need to make sure their equipment is accessible for people with disabilities. But we're looking at that too. So to give you an example of some of the work that we're doing in this space, we have active litigation right now against Kohl's department store. We have a membership base at the ERC. And so oftentimes our members will come to us and tell us that they have problems accessing particular stores or particular places of public accommodations, and we can initiate a testing investigation based on those membership complaints. So we had gotten several complaints from Kohl's. We initiated an investigation. That investigation actually expanded nationwide. We did site surveys at 41 different stores around the country and found violations in all 41 stores. And are now actively in litigation with Kohl's, hoping that they will fix the problems that ail them. Yeah.
What were some of those violations?
So a lot of aisle problems. So for example, if you're someone in a wheelchair, you need a clearance space to be able to get through aisles. So there will be a lot of product on the floor, and in an attempt to get as much product on the floor, the aisles will close into that space. We also see a lot of problems with, and I think this is, here we go. We see a lot of problems with counter heights. So again, someone who has a mobility impairment in a wheelchair, the counter needs to be low enough for them to be able to put product or get product off of the counter. For people who are visually impaired, those nice point of sale machines where you can use your credit card or your ATM card to swipe and pay for your purchases. For someone who's visually impaired, if the buttons are not raised, they can't figure out what things to press to be able to pay for their goods and services. So we're seeing things like that. We're seeing things like in the restrooms, for example. And most people are used to seeing the grab bars, for example, but when you think about if there's a counter and there's someone is washing their hands, and so they've got the water on hot, but they've got piping underneath the counter, and someone in a wheelchair has to go underneath the counter to be able to wash their hands, but the water's gotten hot and someone's burned their leg on the piping. So making sure that the piping underneath is either not exposed or is insulated in a way that someone in a wheelchair is not going to burn their leg if the water's hot. So those are the sorts of things that we're seeing in these spaces. Also parking, making sure that the accessible parking is properly labeled. Well, first that there is accessible parking near an accessible entrance, but also making sure that it's properly labeled so that people who are not disabled are not mistakenly parking in those spaces. you know, they're usually on the side of an accessible space. You may see an extra space that has lines through it, and oftentimes I'll see people who pull into those particular spaces, and what they don't realize is that's there so that someone who has a mobility impairment who's getting out of a van, they need extra space to be able to get out of the van, right? So making sure that those spaces are properly marked so they're available for people with impairments. And so this is an example of the counter height situation. And the laws are highly technical. So the ADA, there have been standards that develop that literally tell you the amount of inches that you're supposed to have in a particular building. And this doesn't apply to every single building. What the ADA has done is said if you build something new after the ADA was passed in 1990, so let's say you build something in 1991, 1992, we expect all of the new buildings and new structures to be built in accordance with these requirements. So it could be an old structure, for example, that was built prior to the ADA, in which case it doesn't necessarily have to be in compliance with all of the requirements under the ADA. But even for things that were built before then, aisles in retail stores, for example, are things that can be fixed literally by making sure that you leave enough clearance between your aisles and not try and crowd so much product onto the floor. So. This is interesting. So this was, I think, a very interesting picture that we took at I'm in Target all the time, goodness gracious. But think about someone who's in a wheelchair and their ability to actually navigate around that beam, right? And their ability to get product off the shelf in that space. So those are the sorts of things we're looking at when we're doing site surveys, is just to see how easy it is for someone with an impairment to do all of the things that we ordinarily would do. It's the makeup aisle. I would definitely be in that aisle. Okay. All right. So one of the other investigations we've done in this space that's not really a measurement kind of testing project, but this was a taxicab investigation. And so we did a testing investigation a while back where we actually tried to figure out if taxicab drivers were stopping for people who were disabled. And so screenshot 1, you'll see that the first person is standing with a well, you can't really see it, but I'll show you a little video. The first person is standing with a service animal, and then a little further down the street you have someone who doesn't have a service animal and does not appear to be disabled. And a cab comes along in the second screenshot, passes the person with the service animal, stops for the person without one to pick them up. So there is, I was going to show you a little bit of a video, if I can find it. They may make you watch an ad. Hopefully not. No, they're going to make you watch an ad. No, it doesn't love me. We're going to pause for a commercial break because they're going to give you a sponsor ad.
Our undercover cameras put you on the street as we document some taxi drivers stranding people with disabilities on the curb. Investigative reporter Russ Potoncic joins us with some troubling images of a taxi system that is getting away with breaking the rules. Russ.
Luckily, it was right here in Georgetown where our undercover operation initially identified the trouble that blacks have getting cabs in Washington. Well, we found a whole new class of people, underserved, and it has nothing to do with the color of their skin. Can you tell me why you passed her?
That guy definitely passed away. We can't tell when we're being denied access.
Why didn't you stop for that lady with the service dog? You went right by her.
No, I thought she was waiting for somebody else.
Watch for yourself on the left side of your screen. He had just passed this blind woman flagging cabs with her service dog nearby. Why didn't you stop for that lady with the service dog? You went right by her.
No, I thought she was waiting for somebody else.
She had her hand out. She was hailing a cab.
effort, Natalie Jackson said the moment was a victory for those who
Can you tell me
watched.
why you passed her? Unfortunately, he wasn't the exception. DC cabs not only passed her, they passed him, and they passed him.
Are you in position?
All working undercover as we tested 42 DC cabs in the cold,
Hailing.
in the rain, and in the dark. Nearly half left them on the street, charged an unauthorized extra fee,
Are you a taxi?
or like this cab,
The west entrance of the National Gallery of Art on Constitution?
took them to the wrong location, leaving our blind volunteers unable to tell where they were. Tell her to ask someone where she is.
Is there anybody nearby you?
We found her hundreds of feet away at the correct building, but the wrong entrance on the wrong street. And when you arrived, where did he tell you were?
He said the same thing. He said, you're right in front of the entrance.
Well, you are right in front of an entrance, it's just not on
Not the right
Constitution.
one.
Yeah,
And I
took us a while to
specifically
find you.
said on Constitution, and he said, yes. And
This cab dropped off our other blind passenger on the wrong block, at the wrong building, on the wrong street.
Harry! This is my guy.
But the biggest failure was cabs not stopping at all.
Did you see the guy in the wheelchair back there? I didn't see it. I didn't see it.
I didn't see him. We heard that again
I was on the phone, I didn't see him.
and again
I didn't see him. I don't mind what it's time for a cop.
and again. Unisa. In the same lane where that yellow cab passes by, blocked by that black Toyota, you can barely see the front right fender of a silver taxi cab come into frame, forced to stop by traffic right in front of our blind passenger. As soon as that bus clears, you can see he didn't pick him up. Instead, he comes right to me. You're parked right next to him. You saw the other guy past him. Why didn't you pick him up?
The cab is the first one. I thought he was gonna pick it up.
But he didn't, obviously.
Yeah, that's why I stopped.
Well, then why didn't you let him in?
That's why I stopped.
Why didn't you let him in? Why didn't you let him in your cab?
I'm waiting for him. That's why I'm backing
Sir,
up.
he's blind.
Stop.
This is a critical problem, and we all need to address it.
Don Call with the Equal Rights Center conducted similar tests in 2010, showing 60% of blind testers received discriminatory service.
Well, it's illegal in a number of ways, of course.
He's pushing for more enforcement from police and the Taxi Commission.
Good morning.
Tester Eric Bridges is an advocate for the American Council of the Blind, but it's his personal battle too.
It happens probably a few times a month.
The Taxi Commission says it just doesn't have the resources to do undercover operations like this. What's your reaction to that?
I find that wholly unacceptable. DC and the cab.
So it's a long segment, but I wanted to show it to you because it's a little more powerful than just seeing the actual screenshots, and it's precisely why we test. Because oftentimes people have no idea the discrimination is happening, and as one person out there trying to fight even just the DC Taxi Cab Commission, you really have an uphill battle.
Did you say you'd also done similar testing with Uber?
No, we have not yet done that.
Interesting to see how that works.
It will be interesting. Other questions? I think that's all I had, so I'm happy to take questions now.
When you finish with your testing, do you take it back to the group that was tested?
Yes. Well, actually, it depends. Let me just say it depends. If it's complaint-based testing, then yes, because obviously we want to give them an opportunity to fix whatever the situation is. Sometimes they do. Sometimes we actually end up in court in litigation, so they know that there's actually a problem if they're unwilling to fix it voluntarily. If it's systemic testing, then that does not always get back to the particular people that we've tested, because that's really being done more for broader research purposes. But obviously, if we see things in the systemic testing that we think warrant specific intervention with a particular employer or developer, then usually we will deal with that. We will deal with that separately.
How do you find participants for your study?
So our testers can be just like you. So oftentimes we advertise for testers. We actually pay testers to do this work. It's important work, and it actually requires a good skill set. I mean, typically you're going in, you have to remember a script, you have to be very well trained. You don't necessarily know when you're going in what you're testing for, in part because we don't want the tester to have their own bias as to what it is they're testing for. So you're going in, you're being trained to deliver a script, to recognize and record particular information, and to report back, which usually involves drafting a narrative and filling out forms, which then become the basis either for the study, our ability to kind of compare test results, but also potentially for litigation and enforcement as well. So we advertise, we have folks that go out and do outreach and talk to various groups. If we're in other places around the country, we might partner with other nonprofits to help us identify particular groups that we need for that testing project. So it's everyday people, in part because these are everyday transactions, right?
If you litigate in federal and state court and municipal courts?
Both.
All across the board. And when you litigate, and what's your batting average when you litigate?
Pretty good.
And do you seek financial restitution or compensation?
Yeah. We do.
And a policy
yes.
change?
Yes. Yes. So we litigate pretty much in every kind of forum. So we have administrative litigation ongoing, state and federal litigation, both in DC and also in other places around the country. So the Coles litigation is actually in federal court in Illinois right now. And we have organizational standing in our litigation. And so usually what we are looking for is compensation for our expenses to do the actual investigation. But we're also looking for them to engage in behavior in the future designed to make sure it doesn't happen again. So the goal is to get them for at least a period of time to do follow-up testing if testing is something that identified the problem, or if it's a training issue. Oftentimes in the retail space, for example, if it's not a structural thing, it's people leaving things in the aisle because they just don't understand that if you clutter your aisles that somebody can't get through. That's really a training issue, right? Making sure that the managers of your stores know to do a spot check around the store that your aisles are relatively clear, right? So those are the sort of things that we're asking people to do as a follow-up to our testing to get it right the next time. So.
I have a question about I guess it would be in DC, maybe under protected classes. Because you talk about a single mother with a child, but in the workplace, have you ever had a case of, seen the case of like emotional career path with a woman with children versus one without?
Mm-hmm. And that's a really interesting issue. The challenge with the promotion space is you have to have people that are kind of already in place at that particular employer. But looking at the kind of the family responsibilities discrimination dynamic, I think is something that we're really interested in doing. There's been a lot of academic research in that space where they're doing resume testing, and so they'll have one resume that reflects some family responsibilities and one that doesn't. And that's certainly coming back as there being a very high level of discrimination when there are family responsibilities indicated. The challenge we have is once we get out of the application space and the promotion space, we're dealing with people who are kind of already there, and so it becomes really difficult to duplicate that specific scenario. But it is something that we're aware of.
I guess in the interview process for an application, the interviewer is not supposed to ask,
right,
are you married, do you have children, those sorts of things.
Right, right. And oftentimes they won't. I mean, because most people know not to ask. I mean, it's and that's the interesting thing about discrimination now is not only does it come with, a smile and a handshake, but people know not to engage in certain behavior. And so you're really looking oftentimes for kind of proxies for that behavior, right? Or looking to see just what happens as a result once they have the information in front of them, because there are still places that will ask you, do you have children? I see you have children, I don't think you're going to be able to travel, sort of situation. But oftentimes they know better to actually ask now.
My mom is actually a mobility instructor, so if you don't know, she teaches blind people how to get around. And when she was working, I think 2 summers ago, she ran into an issue at one of the colleges near where I live, where all of the braille under the little plaques outside of each door said classroom. So it'd be like in like just normal writing, it would be like classroom 104, but the braille would only say classroom. So if you're blind, you couldn't like figure out which classroom was which one. Would something as small as that be like considered, like would you be able to like go to court against the college if they like refuse to change that?
Yeah, you probably could. I mean, the chances are that once you told them to change it, they would. I would hope they would change it. And I think we always lean towards the first shot out the bow is, you've got this problem, this is how it impacts people. Because I think sometimes people don't recognize how it impacts people. I mean, I would have to say my background is employment and worker issues. So for me, the first time I really understood or even started to see, I can't even say understood, but really started to see what it was like for somebody with a mobility impairment was my sister-in-law's sister. Is paralyzed and in a wheelchair. And when I would go visit them and we would go places, and you'd see, this was before I even came to work at the Equal Rights Center, you'd see just how difficult it was. Okay, well, we can't get in that way. How are we going to get in? Okay, where's the accessible entrance? And you realize all of the extra issues that someone has to navigate when you're out with them. And I think a lot of people, myself included, haven't had a whole lot of experience of having to walk in somebody else's shoes. In that space. And I think when you explain to people this is what they are experiencing in that space, if you don't put the numbers on the classrooms, most people in my experience get it and want to fix it. Every once in a while you run into people who are just recalcitrant. And in which case, yes, in those situations, and in that situation in particular, I would think the law would be a fine instrument to use. Okay.
First, I want to say the work you guys are doing is great. And I was wondering, since we are on a campus setting, how close do you guys work with the academics? Because like there's a working paper series with the National Bureau of Economic Research that's done a lot of jobs and discrimination related to gender and stuff. So how close do you guys follow that literature or work with academics to like kind of see how this plays out in academia and translate that into the real world practice?
We follow it. We like to work with them a lot closer. I think they've done some, as an example, some of the work that's been done in academia in the reentry space, particularly in the employment space, has been really interesting. And is showing a lot of discrimination happening even in the context of race. So when you take you take an African American who has a criminal record, and you take someone who's white who has a criminal record, and you send them in, or you submit a resume for the same job, the African American with the criminal record is being held to a much higher standard, sort of thing. And that's in the academic literature all over the place. And so for us, one thing we're looking at is how do we then take that academic literature to the next step, or the next stage, because the ERC is in a bit of a different place, and that we're doing that work really to support positive policy advocacy, but also have enforcement as something that we can do in our tool belt. So I think we follow the literature and are very interested in it, and I think for us, for the future, figuring out how we can better partner to take that literature into the real world is something we want to do. Yeah. There is. Yes. And they've done some really great, the gender issue that we talked about, that research has been really resume testing in that space. And so it's really about taking it from the academic space and figuring out how you tweak it and get it in a real world setting with actual testers. But yeah, it's really interesting work to be done in the future, I think.
How do you handle a situation where you have a building from, let's say, the 1920s, which hasn't been accommodated for the standards set in the ADA,
So there's nothing you can do really structurally about that building because the ADA really only applies to, and the design requirements under the Fair Housing Act really only apply to things built after 1991, I think is the time period. So oftentimes what we'll do is, even if you can't get the design, the structural design to comply with the ADA, you can come up with creative ways to provide reasonable accommodations for people who have disabilities so that then maybe they can't access a building or a structure in the same way that someone without that disability can, but you can at least provide some sort of accommodations that allow them to access it in a different way. And in that instance, that would be okay under the ADA because it was built, it's an old building. No one is requiring anybody to go back and actually rebuild anything that's old. If someone is doing a significant amount of renovation, however, then the question becomes, as a part of you doing that significant renovation, do you have the opportunity then to bring it more in compliance with the standards under the ADA? So.
Does the center do outreach kind of on the policy side with maybe corporations or companies to let them know about things, kind of do that kind of advocacy on the front end in addition to the testing and that? Do you guys do that work as well?
We aren't doing it right, well, no, that's not true. We are doing some of it. I don't think we're doing a lot of it at this point. On some level, it's akin to kind of the videotape evidence of what we're seeing in the criminal justice space. Like, people don't really believe it until they actually see it. Like, if you have a conversation up front, oftentimes with a company, their reaction is, and I think honestly their reaction is, well, we don't do that. You know, we're not a company, we're not about that, we're about being inclusive, we're about diversity. And I think that is true from their corporate vantage point, and they don't necessarily see on the front lines what's actually happening. So, and a lot of companies, when they do see on the front lines what's actually happening, are very open to, okay, we have a problem and we want to get this fixed, and we want to get it fixed quickly. And that's really what I think we want to see is once we've identified an issue there, we want to know that you as a responsible corporate entity are going to engage and get it fixed as quickly as possible.
We've seen a lot of sort of focus on the police and racial discrimination lately. Do you think that that's something that you may try to test in the future?
We keep having ongoing conversations about how can we do it, and the thing that is creating a bit of a barrier is we want to make sure that our testers are always safe, and we don't want to put them in an environment where something could potentially happen. And so we've shied away from doing it, but we are continuing to have conversations about how we can maybe even get to some of the ancillary spaces in the criminal justice space. So it's just conversations that are continuing.
There's a thing called an IAM testing. I don't know if you know what that is. Do you think that that should be a thing that everyone should do before they're hired at a job to make sure that they're not discriminating even subconsciously?
That's an interesting question. And I've seen that there has been a lot of, actually I took one online just to see, but then they didn't give me results. So I wanted to see, because everybody has biases, right? And part of the issue with unconscious biases is we don't know that they're there. I think when you probably have a better shot of at least of thinking about them when you accept the fact that they are there. And on some level, getting people to take those kinds of tests so that then they can understand that this isn't someone pointing at you and saying, you're a racist, you're a horrible person. It's everybody acknowledging that we all have these subconscious and unconscious biases that are a product of how we've been raised and what we've experienced and what we've been told. And if we are more conscious and accept that we all have them, then we're going to be more open when someone says to you, look, when you do X, I feel like I'm not being included in this community. And when you're coming from that vantage point, you're going to be far more open to kind of hearing and listening and being more accommodating than when you're coming from the vantage point of, I have no unconscious unconscious biases. And so I think those sorts of tests, while I don't think I'm going to take a position as whether or not everyone should take them for jobs, are useful in that sort of a social context. And I think would be very interesting. I'm still upset though that I did not get the results from my online tests because I.
You had mentioned LGBT generally in the testing you've done. Have you done specific testing around transgender folks and the things they're up against in workplace and retail settings and that kind of thing?
We're actually engaged in that testing right now. Yeah.
You have a room full of students here. Do you have intern opportunities or other opportunities for students who are interested in this?
We do. We have interns in the fall, spring, and summer who help us with when we get calls. Specifically, we're always looking for things that we can test. And so our interns help us kind of screen through some of the calls that we get. We also work with students who are testing. And frankly, being a tester and being a student is highly compatible because testing is not something, it's not a 9-to-5 sort of thing. It's just that a particular project has come up. And because it's very important that we match our control and protected testers so that they're similar in almost every respect except the one we're testing, we have to have a very large pool of testers. And so students being able to do that and actually make a little money on the side to do it is, I think, kind of a cool thing to do. So we actually, I'm only a lawyer in my previous life. I have to keep reminding myself, but we actually partner with other law firms who actually do the litigation on behalf of the ERC. The ERC is now, I'm actually a client, which is a very different space to be in, and not the litigator. Used to driving that. I drive the lawyers crazy because of it, but we do work with lawyers who actually represent us in that litigation. Any more questions? Well, this has been, oh, I'm sorry. No, go.
Speaking of students, as I have students here, do you ever hear of any discrimination in the college application process? Which is just,
yeah.
mainly on paper or online, but are there things that colleges can look at? I mean, I know they have, I'm curious.
That's a really interesting question. I would have to have my folks who actually are doing the testing in the office kind of think through it. It's not something that's come up in our space. I mean, I think we've been, as of late, really kind of focused in the LGBT space and very focused in the housing and employment and disability space. I think one thing that could be really interesting is looking at accessibility issues on college campuses. So the issue you raised about whether or not the Braille actually gives people the room number and how easy it is for someone with a disability to navigate. In that context, I think would be a really interesting thing to look at, particularly as people are moving more towards kind of internet-based or online learning. The web accessibility in that space is going to become increasingly important. And so that's a space where I think we are paying a lot of attention to. Language access is a space where we're paying a lot of attention to that. Looking at a lot of government services and the ability of people who speak other languages to access important government services is a space where we're concentrating right now. Well, thank you so much. This has been really interesting.